Welcome to another program in our series, Freethinking Forum. My name is Bill Weir. I'm producer and host, and I'm delighted to have with me today Ann Krisnik.
Thank you.
Ann, you're Executive Director of Joint, what is the full name?
Joint Religious Legislative Coalition.
Coalition, yes. A beautiful name. And I understand that this was the first in the nation.
It still is the only one in the nation. So the
Only
JRLC is an interfaith group. Our sponsors are the Minnesota Council of Churches, the Minnesota Catholic Conference, the Jewish Community Relations Council, and the Islamic Center of Minnesota. Formed back in the 70s, and so it's common in Minnesota and states around the country for people of faith to come together around a specific issue, but the JRLC is unusual in the sense that we've continued to work together, and so really work to find common ground among those different religious beliefs and organizations and figure out how we can help people of faith have a strong voice at the Capitol to impact policy.
Good. And I take it that if one member has a policy they would like to get enacted, you don't act on it unless the other three agree.
Right, and so our board decides. Actually, our process is not only our board deciding, but then we go back to the boards of each of those individual organizations. And so there are some issues that we're not going to address at all. We know that we're not going to find consensus around issues involving Palestine and Israel, for example, so we just steer clear of those. There's some others that we do that, but otherwise we work really hard to find consensus and see through that careful dialogue if we can find common ground. Great.
Well, no wonder Minnesota works a little better than most states. And how do you spell out the mission? Is that?
Yeah, I think our mission, we have a formal mission statement, but the simplest way is using the values of the Abrahamic religions, Christian, Jewish, Islamic religion. How do we use those values to inform policy decisions at the state? And so part of that is assessing what our religions say and figuring out, what the different guidance we have from each of those. But then the next important step is how do we engage people of faith to go to the Capitol and use those beliefs to talk to their legislators. So the board in the initial stage is working on what positions do we want to take, what are the issues that are currently kind of important in Minnesota that the faith community can and should have an impact on. And then the next piece, once we decide those, is really to help people feel comfortable talking to their legislator, building a relationship through email, through town hall meetings, and a number of ways to have that voice be strongly heard.
Now, I've noticed on many of these issues you are teamed up with other coalitions.
Mm-hmm.
What are some examples of that?
Yeah, and I think most work, especially at the Capitol, there are a lot of coalitions. So a couple examples that we're involved in. One is what's the Kids Can't Wait Coalition, which really works on childcare, access to childcare affordability. And so we are in that coalition along with the Children's Defense Fund, the Legal Aid of Minnesota, Catholic Charities, the child care providers, and a number of other groups, People Serving People, which works with homeless folks. Mm-hmm. We are part of Prosperity for All, which is a group that is really working to try to address the issues that we see facing very low income Minnesotans, and especially those on the Minnesota Family Investment Program or others. So in different issues, you're in coalition with different people.
Yes.
So we're working on some gambling expansion, concerned about some gambling expansion issues, and that's a whole different group of people that we're working with. Last year we worked on a bill to really get rid of the marriage disincentive that's involved in the Minnesota Family Investment Program. There'd be couples that would really like to get married, and we know that marriage is a good tool out of poverty, but they were going to have a really significant hit if they did that.
A loss of benefits.
Right.
Just because they're married.
Right. And so we worked with people on both sides of the aisle and a number of groups and said, how do we address this? We really want to have an incentive for, or maybe not, we didn't create an incentive, we removed the disincentive. We don't want to discourage people from getting married if that's what they'd like to do. So those are a whole different group of people then.
Well, and you've just issued a poverty progress report for Minnesota. Tell us about that.
Well, in 2009, the legislature released a bipartisan report from the Legislative Commission to End Poverty in Minnesota by 2020. So a lofty goal. We're getting to 2020, and so we thought it was really important for somebody to step up and really look at how are we doing on addressing poverty. So the report had a number of recommendations with 3 specific benchmarks. One was to reduce the poverty rates among racial minority groups to the national average by 2012. One was to cut poverty rates for children in half by 2014, and then the final was to eliminate poverty in Minnesota by 2020, which we aren't there yet. But we haven't met those benchmarks. So we thought it's important to make sure that this is part of the discussion, that people are thinking about all the issues that impact low and moderate income Minnesotans, but not in a way that was critical. You know, we've made progress, and so the report really says here are some things that we've done, but here are some things we still need to work on.
I see the report gives one page to notable progress since 2009, and you spelled out some of the next steps. What's next?
Well, before we get to next, I want to talk a little bit about what we've done. So, and one of the things that the report I think does a really nice job of doing, as did the bipartisan legislative report that was issued in 2009, is showing there are so many different areas that impact people that are really struggling. So it's not a simple case of if I have a better paying job, it's fine, or if I have a better school, I'm fine, but really needing to look at, can I find a job that pays a living wage, and can I find access and quality daycare, childcare that I can send my kids to? Can I live in a place where I feel safe? Do I have access either to a transportation line so I can get to work and to childcare, or can I afford a reliable car? So a lot of those issues come into play. So what we did when we went through our report was really kind of tracked what the legislative report was doing and looking at a number of areas. So for example, the very first recommendation in the report was to raise the minimum wage, and recognizing really the need to have a higher wage so people working those low income jobs can really make a living. So we did that, and it's not only raised, it's tied to inflation, and so it'll be indexed as inflation goes on. So that's one of the things we listed as notable progress.
That's a great step forward, getting it indexed too.
Yeah. Right now Minnesota has the lowest unemployment rate it's had in quite a while, so we noted that as progress. We've seen foreclosures really at a significantly lower rate than when the report came out. So there are a number of areas where we really have been making progress, and we want to make sure to recognize those and celebrate those, but there's still more to do.
Yeah, you got that foreclosure rate down to 0.2%.
Yeah.
Wow. And it had been up to what, 5?
Well, and especially you think of, so many people were underwater and so many people were overextended. And part of that is regulation, part of that is our economy is doing well. So a lot of those things play into it. But it's important to recognize not only the foreclosure rate piece, but when we look at housing, we really wanted to look a little bit at homelessness issues. Minnesota's done a very impressive job at addressing homelessness for veterans. We've seen some reductions for homeless youth. And so, we want to make sure we can do this. Look at what we've done with veterans. Let's make sure we do that for the rest of our citizens as well.
Well, I think state and county personnel have contributed to that too.
Greatly.
Kathy Tenbrook, is it? Working at the state level, and David, the head of the Hennepin County and Minneapolis program to end homelessness.
And one of the things that the legislative report said, and that we really wanted to build on, is there's no one single entity or group or organization that's responsible for this. So government isn't solely responsible for taking care of all of Minnesota, but they're not relieved of that responsibility either. So we need individuals, we need nonprofits, corporations, business, state and local government, churches, to all do their part if we're really going to make a change. So this isn't a report of saying these are the 10 things that government did wrong, or these are the 10 things they did right, or this is what they need to do. It does really address the policy issues that legislators have a role in setting, but a lot of the issues can't be done by government alone. We need other people to step in as well.
And I've been part of forming a Unitarian Universalist affordable housing partnership that has now progressed into Minnesota UU Social Justice Alliance. But originally we were focusing on getting, well, first of all, helping build the homes with the users, with the people who will be living there in Habitat for Humanity, and also lobbying, of course, and also providing the last 5% of the money needed for affordable housing.
Well, and where you live affects so many parts of your life. You know,
Yes.
where your children go to school, how safe your neighborhood is, whether you have access to transportation, so many things. Whether you're in a food desert or you have access to fresh and affordable things to eat for your family. So that's wonderful. That's great.
Yeah, I expect that we would often be part of that coalition too, the Moose Jaw, as we call it.
Yeah, and we're part of Homes for All. They're part of Homes for All, which is really working on both money for bonding, for both to create affordable housing and to preserve and restore and maintain the housing that exists, as well as some other appropriations.
Well, carrying on from what we did many years ago. Yeah, and probably you were working on it at that point too. And so have we covered all the points about where has Minnesota made progress?
Well, I'm going to make a little plug. So if people want to read more about it, the full poverty report is on our webpage at jrlc.org, so I'd encourage people to go there. But just a couple other things that we reference. The percentage of Minnesotans without health insurance has dropped substantially since 2009, and we'll see how that plays out with some of the changes that people are looking at. Every Minnesota county has some type of transit system. That doesn't mean across the full county people have access to transit, but we're seeing a greater recognition of the importance of that. And then we've highlighted a couple of specific pilot programs. So one is a program called the Getting to Work program, cleverly named, and it's designed to give tax incentives to, say, a repair garage that does repairs for low-income families at a reduced rate. So either people donate cars and they fix them, and then they're available to low and moderate income Minnesotans, or they actually do repairs for people. So there are some programs that we wanted to kind of highlight as well and say, this seems to be working and it's effective, and let's make sure we pay attention and maybe do more.
When I worked for Prism in the northwest suburbs, they had mechanics fixing up cars that had been donated to make them available to very low-income people for getting to work.
It's very hard. An issue that doesn't address is insurance as well, is a real challenge for low-income people. And it's not just buying the car and being able to maintain the car, but insurance as well. So
yes.
In Hennepin County, you have the Lift Garage, which was started by a social worker who really saw a need to address the transportation challenges for families. And so she got trained on how to do auto mechanic repair. I'm probably using the wrong term with that. And she founded the Lift Garage. And it serves all kinds of families and communities. And it's just
Great.
A wonderful example of what can be done and options that really should be available to people. And we need our state to encourage them.
And so there's still work to do.
There's always work to do.
And, do you want to focus on transportation, the transportation housing chart?
Yeah, one of the things when we talked about what have we done, and then we looked at what do we still need to do. And so the whole middle section of the report is by area in childcare, education, transportation, helping Minnesotans build assets to plan for the future. What do we still need to work on? But one of the things we looked at, and hopefully you can put the chart up for the viewers to see, was really looking at across Minnesota, what are people spending on housing and transportation? The general recommended across the board, when you see a recommendation of what you should be spending on transportation and housing, it's no more than 45% of your income with those two combined. Because if you live where there's a wonderful transit system, you maybe live somewhere where it's more expensive to live. If you live somewhere where it's cheaper to live, transportation is going to cost you more because you probably need a car or a vehicle. You don't live on a bus line. And so we did an assessment within the 7-county area, metro area, and then the rest of Minnesota, people who have what we call moderate income. So you look at the median income in whatever the community is, this was by county, and 80% of that is the moderate income. So these are people who are working as paramedics, mental health counselors, machinists, the people that you see at the hospital and the nursing home, a lot of them. And of course, people doing retail and hospitality and all of those kinds of things as well. And so looked at people at that 80% of the median income. What are they spending on just transportation and housing without looking at food or clothing or anything else, any medical expenses? And in the 7-county metro area, 56%, those people, the average 56% of their income they're spending on that combination, so more than half. And in greater Minnesota, that's 62%. So that's
wow.
a really significant amount of money. And so this is when you hear stories about people saying, I have a full-time job, it may be at a lower rate, but I have a full-time job and I can't make ends meet because they're spending so much on transportation and housing. And then
62% instead of 45%.
Yeah. And then you're really having to make decisions about, am I going to buy food? Am I going to buy medicine? We have parents say, I save all year. Whenever I have some extra money, I put it away so that I have some money for cough syrup, because that's really expensive if they need that later during the year. And that's how that comes about, because such a significant part of their income, the household income, is going for those two basic expenses.
Now, if there's nothing else on transportation, housing, I see there's a racial disparity chart here also.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, I think the chart's fairly self-explanatory and disappointing. If you recall, one of the goals of the commission when they issued the report in 2009 was to reduce the poverty rate among Minnesotans of color. So the chart really addresses three things, or lays out three things. The first is just the disparity in home ownership between white Minnesotans and Minnesotans of color. And for Minnesotans of color, it's 41%. For white Minnesotans, 76%, almost double. So that's significantly difference. Part of that is history of redlining, part of that is difficulty finding positions, but a lot of it is all the different ways that racism is still really present and impacting people in our state. We looked at the percentage of students who graduate on time. So, you go through your kindergarten in 1 through 12 and how many graduate on time. And among white students across Minnesota, that's almost 90%, 88%. But for students of color, 69%.
Quite a difference.
Yes, and that's even without looking into test scores and a number of other things where you really see a significant achievement gap between white students and students of color, and in a lot of ways an opportunity gap as well. And then the last thing we did is we just wanted to kind of get a sense of the median household income for different groups and what they look like. So I'm just going to read these off if people don't want to look it up. But for white households in Minnesota, the median household income is $90,500. For Asian Pacific Islanders, $70,900. And then we really start to see a drop. For people that are 2 or more races, it drops to $50,900. For American Indians, $44,300, which is less than half of the white average. For Hispanic and Latino, $38,000. And for Black Minnesotans, the median household income is $32,000, which is just over a third of what we see for white Minnesotans. So this has a lot of impact, not just in terms of what I can spend money on right now, but one of the things that the report really talks about is the importance of figuring out a way to help Minnesotans build assets. Because if I have a job and I have a wage, that's how I get by. But if I can't build up any assets, I can never get ahead. If I can't do that, I never have enough to cover my new tire that I need, or I can never save up enough to move to a better apartment, or all those kinds of things. And so one of the things we really see is the less, when you look at that income, it not just impacts what I can do here, but it creates people from being able to move ahead. Every time they have an unexpected medical expense, or they have a car issue that they weren't expecting, those things can just knock out a family or household completely. And that's not a path for success. That's not a way that we help Minnesotans build and plan for the future.
Yeah. Well, thank you for letting us know about this. I hope people go to your website to see this and download it and share it with other people too.
And I hope they do. If you contact us, we'll send out copies and share it. And one of the things we're doing with the report, because it's really statewide data, it's not just about a particular area, is we want to make sure that people around the state are really talking about this, especially as we have an election coming up and talking to candidates for office. And so we have different congregations and groups of congregations around the state that are getting together and saying, let's really sit down and let's look at what we see about poverty statewide, what do we see in our congregations, in our communities, and really talk about what does our faith call us to do. And so the goal is really to use this as a trigger to get people talking about individually what they can do, and then also to make sure when they're talking with candidates at town halls or people are outdoor knocking, to really say what can you do to address this. We tried very hard to make sure that the report didn't say, these are all the things that we like and they're all Democratic ideas, or these are all the things they like and they're conservative ideas. So there are a number of issues that we raise, and politicians might have a different way or different ideas about how to solve the problem. But in my work at the Capitol, in my interactions with policymakers, all elected officials want Minnesotans to be successful. And so we just want to make sure that this is part of what people are thinking about when they decide how to create the blueprint for a state.
So maybe it takes time to call on the legislators at their St. Paul Capitol office and bringing this along to point out some of the things that were very important about to address.
And if you look across the board at legislators, some are very active on tax policy, some are very active on transportation, some sit on the Health and Human Services Committee. So we recognize that different people are going to have different interests or different areas of expertise, but in all of those, there are ways that we can really help strengthen the safety net or really build a more solid platform so Minnesotans can build for a successful future.
Good. That's what we want. So, and you've outlined what you want people to do with the report. Are there legislative issues that you could talk about?
Yeah, the report isn't a legislative agenda, and we made it very clear that we weren't tying it to specific legislative issues. Although, because of the work we do, we're working on social justice kind of issues and a lot of poverty issues. So our legislative agenda is often going to be overlaying a number of these. But so the report is just kind of saying, where are we? Where should we go from here? We still have work to do what it's going to be. Separate from that, we have our legislative agenda for this year. So this year, we're working on a number of issues that are directly tied to the report. One is really addressing homeless families. That right now there's a child care assistance program in Minnesota, which is wonderful. If people are eligible, they look at your income. In several places like Hennepin County, there's a significant wait list, so that's an issue we need to deal with. But we've had a number of homeless families that apply, and there's typically a 30-day period of time to see if you're eligible. So we have legislation both to address, or bills in play to shorten that to 5 days. And then the second piece of that is, if I'm homeless, to waive the typical education or work requirement for 60 days. Because it's really hard if I'm in this chaotic situation to be trying to find a job and trying to find a place to live and trying to figure out how I'm going to have someone watch my children. Yeah. So the second piece of that legislation is to say for 60 days, we would waive those requirements while people are either figuring out their education program or they're finding a job, because it's very difficult to look for work when you have 2 or 3 kids that you're having to take care of. So we're working on that. We talked a little bit about asset building a moment ago, and one of the bills that we're working on is a kind of a perfect example of that. Right now, if I was rushing here to the studio and I was late and I got pulled over and I got a speeding ticket, I'd have the amount that Hennepin County or Brooklyn Center, whatever, depending on who gave me the ticket, charges, and then there's an automatic $75 surcharge for that. So the ticket itself, I live in Ramsey County, the ticket, if I got a ticket there, is $40. Then you have the $75 surcharge. There's a $10 charge for a law library fee. There's another diversion program charge of $1 or $2. So your ticket of $40 ends up being really an expensive ticket. And oftentimes you have people who can't pay those. They don't pay them because they're unwilling to, they just can't afford to.
And they lose their license.
Right. And so they suddenly find out that their license is suspended, which creates a whole nother practical and financial process. And so we have a bill that we're working on with the Asset Building Coalition to change the law so that I only would get my license suspended if I'm a dangerous driver. Okay, so if I'm charged with reckless driving, if I have a DWI, there's some language about habitual offenders, so if I'm continually getting tickets. But we shouldn't be criminalizing being poor. And that's really what ends up happening now. You have people who end up in this downward spiral because they couldn't pay that single ticket. And it's particularly frustrating because I often need that transportation in order to work. So then we put people in the situation, am I going to drive with a suspended license because I can't pay this because I need to get to work, or I can't pay that housing and all those different expenses? Or am I not going to drive and then I'm going to lose my position that is tied up in all those things?
Oh, I sure hope that passes.
It's through, it's in the Transportation Finance Omnibus Bill. It's also moving through the House as a separate bill. It's set to be heard on the floor sometime in the next week, and moving through the Senate. We'll see what happens there.
Well, maybe we should write our members of the House or the Senate on this too.
Yes, it's one of those little things that make such a huge difference. And once you get into that hole trying to dig your way out and you keep having penalties because you're late and things, it's really, really a challenge.
We have less than 2 minutes left.
Okay,
So,
went quickly.
Is there one other, have we covered the things you're working on?
If I could, my closing statement would always be that everyone in Minnesota has a voice. And the way to have that voice heard is to talk with your legislators. And that may be individual discussions, that may be emails, that may be phone calls, but they need to hear what the views are in their district in order to represent everyone. And so I just, don't be intimidated by that process. Go to our webpage at JRLC.org, and there's a whole section on how to advocate for issues. But we want to make sure, regardless of what issues people are advocating on, that all the voices are heard, because we're going to get the best legislation if there's a number of voices.
Yes.
So.
And the day on the Hill that you have, each February, is it?
Well,
March?
Yeah, in a long session it's in February, and the shorter session this year it was in March.
Yeah, good. Now, how can people get a mailing list?
Go to JRLC.org, and there's a place where you can sign up to get on our action alert. There's obviously a place where you can donate if you want to support our work in that way.
That's important too.
But there's a number of tabs there. The poverty report right now is very prominently featured on our landing page. But if you go in, you can see there's advocacy resources. There's a number of all kinds of things there. So we had a wonderful experience with a nonprofit that helped us redo our webpage, so it's very usable now.
Thank you so much, Ann, for giving us a very good outline of the progress that JRLC has made and how we can help with more progress.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, it was very valuable. Thank you for listening.